There were lots of teams who were winners or losers at the NBA draft withdrawal deadline for college players. But Andy, what were the most impactful individual decisions affecting teams?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, what's up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, coming at you 5 days a week. Yes, even in the off season. Andy and I, or Andy or I, and all our wonderful guests will be joining you Monday through Friday. And seriously, we love it. It's such a joy. Hopefully you all do too. We want to keep bringing the college hoops to you all summer long. And in fact, this episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, the official sports book of the Locked On Network. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Andy, I'm super excited about this topic, which, by the way, folks, Andy himself came up with out of his very own brain. So here's what we're doing. Instead of the who are the best players leaving or going, what we tried to do is come up with what were the 6 most impactful individual decisions, either for good or for bad. And that's how we're looking at this. Now, the 2 most obvious of those decisions are Oscar Tshiebwe and Zach Edey, the 2 most recent national players of the year.
Right.
We talked about them last week on Thursday's show. And so we're going to skip by them. So don't get all mad and blow. Why didn't Andy and Isaac talk about Oscar? Or is that, well, we've already done. So that's just too easy. We wanted to dive a little deeper for you today to look beyond them. By the way, this is also not what teams were the winners or losers. For example, Michigan State was clearly a winner at the deadline, but we didn't have either AJ Hoggard or Jaden Akins as one of the most impactful individual decisions. So you won't find Michigan State or either of them on today's show. Makes sense? Makes sense. With that said, we're going to do 2 in each segment. So our first segment is 2 different Big East players. Andy, why don't you start us off with the first one?
Yeah, we got to talk about Andre Jackson. Because I think, we're talking about the defending national champs, always impactful when you're talking about a team that tried to win it or that won it all. They're trying to win it all again. A team that already lost Jordan Hawkins to the NBA draft. Adama Sanogo stays in the NBA draft. Andre Jackson does not return to UConn for next season. The ultimate glue guy. One of the best glue guys in all of college basketball last year. And look, the thing about
gluiest, Andy,
the gluiest glue guy. The thing about Jackson is, and I know that most of you everyday listeners have certainly watched a ton of college basketball. You certainly watched UConn in the NCAA tournament. Anybody who watched pretty much any of UConn's games in the tournament knows how valuable Andre Jackson was. But for people who might just be looking at the stat sheet, perusing basketballreference.com, they might see that Andre Jackson averaged under 7 points per game last year. And they might think, is that really the most impactful outside of course, Tshiebwe and Edey player whose decision impacted the team the most? And I would still argue, because Andre Jackson did everything. He may have only averaged about 7 points per game last year, but he averaged over 6 rebounds. He averaged 4.5 assists. He averaged 1.1 steals. He's not a great shooter. And it's interesting that we're talking about a player where scoring is not the worst thing that they do, but it's far from his best attribute. He's a better rebounder. He's a better passer. He's a phenomenal passer, and his ability to find open players in transition was something that just decimated the teams they played in the NCAA tournament. It really hampered Gonzaga. It really hampered every team that they played, quite honestly. His ability to find open players, to just do the little things. And Danny Hurley loves this guy, talked about him a bunch, about how he was a team leader and a captain and an integral part of what this team did. And again, a player who declared for the NBA draft, and it was kind of 50-50. And I think one of the parts of this exercise that we're doing here on the show is looking at players where it was a bit more of a 50-50 decision. Like certainly somebody like Julian Strawther is massively impactful. He's not coming back to Gonzaga, but it was never expected that he was going to come back to Gonzaga. So that's they had kind of already moved on in that process. Whereas with Jackson, it was unclear kind of right up to the last minute, but he started showing up a lot on some late first mock drafts and really did some impressive stuff at the combine. And personally, I'm not surprised at all to see him go in the NBA. And I'm very interested in where he will go in the NBA, like how early teams will be willing to draft a player who doesn't necessarily look at this time like he's going to be a plus 3-point shooter, which for anybody under 6'10" at this point, you pretty much have to be a 3-point shooter in the NBA. And I think he could get there. We were talking offline just before we started here that 3-point shooting is one of the easiest skills to improve when you get into the NBA and all you're focused on is playing basketball. And for Jackson, I wouldn't be shocked to see him make some improvement in that area. But he's a player that just really strikes me as somebody who could blossom into a really good NBA player. And for UConn, it's a pretty tough loss for a team that already lost a lot of their guard depth. Joey Calcaterra is out the door for graduation. Naheem Aline transfers to St. John's. That's a tough loss for them, and losing Jackson. I think they're going to be fine. They're going to find talent. They've already found some talent to kind of replenish, but this is a tough player to lose because he does a little bit of everything for this UConn program.
I think you're right, Andy. Like, despite him being the 6th leading scorer on the team, I think he, maybe along with Sanogo and Jordan Hawkins, is a top 3 most important player on that team. And so, now they lose all 3 of those guys, and that is really painful. I love what you're saying there about how much Danny Hurley loves him. I've read the same comments about his teammates talking about like he's the best teammate I've ever played with. And yet he's this guy that you look up his bio or his Wikipedia accolades by his name in terms of individual awards. The only thing it says is national champion. Yeah. But I think if you were to talk to Andre Jackson, that's the only one that he would care about is like, hey, did I play on a team that beat the other 362 teams in Division I last year? Cool, right? Like, and so that's what it's all about, and that's why little peek behind the curtain. Maybe this is spilling the tea, but in Locked On's NBA mock draft, he went with the last pick of the first round. He was 30th overall, and I frankly can't blame a team for going and doing just that. Andy, let's stay in the Big East here, and it's interesting because while we're talking about individual decisions, when we get to Creighton, there were 2 decisions right there at the end that honestly, I didn't think either of them were going to happen. And that's Ryan Kalkbrenner and Trey Alexander. And I know we got to be a little bit quick on these guys moving along, but I legit thought that they would both stay in the draft and had kind of written it off, in fact, personally. But what I want to do here, since we're just talking about individual decisions, is each pick between Ryan Kalkbrenner and Trey Alexander, which of those 2 do we each think was the most impactful, again, for Creighton for next year because of their decision to come back? Well, I'll let you go first.
Well, I'm going to take Kalk then. I'm going to take the big fella, Ryan Kalkbrenner. 16 points, 6 boards, about 2 blocks per game last year. 2-time Big East Defensive Player of the Year. Just an anchor, an absolute anchor for them in an era where back to the basket, low post scoring bigs are dominating college basketball and not necessarily dominating in the NBA or not being utilized in that role in the NBA. I'm not as shocked to see Kalkbrenner come back because of that, but he has a little bit more stretch ability, some more outside shooting ability than many of the other bigs that kind of get lumped into that group. But for them to bring a player back who is going to legitimately contend to be the defensive player of the year in all of college basketball next year, it's hard for me to not rank him number 1. They lost their point guard in Ryan Nembhard. They lost Arthur Kaluma to the portal. They got some guard depth coming in that I think is going to be really impactful, but they needed Kalkbrenner to come back in order to be a team that competes for a top 3 spot in the Big East and potentially a top 5 or top 8 seed, at least in March Madness.
Man, Andy, this Big East just keeps being
wild, right?
So ridiculously loaded. I'm going to take Trey Alexander, and I would have done that even if you hadn't said Ryan Kalkbrenner. I do have a little reservation with Kalkbrenner just because of the injury bug. And when healthy, I don't know that I could negate anything you just said, right? Like, but I just do have a little bit of pause and caution and hesitation. Sure. Any other synonyms? Like, because of that. But man, Trey Alexander, 13.6 a game on points, 4.2 rebounds. I love that. Just north of 2.5 assists. Shot over 40% from 3 last year, and that commodity is such an important thing for any college team. It's often said, we maybe don't talk about it as much because we're trying to not denigrate our game, but NBA folks talk about all the time what terrible floor spacing college basketball teams have. And to have somebody like Trey Alexander, who not only is a floor spacer, but so incredibly athletic and can do everything he does for the Blue Jays, I just see a world in which like we could look up this time next year and Trey Alexander is the 23-24 Big East Player of the Year. Like that wouldn't shock me in any way. Now, that said, the same is true for Kalkbrenner. If he has a healthy year, I can see him being the Big East Player of the Year. But to know that, and obviously we haven't mentioned Baylor Shireman, but to get all three of those guys back for Creighton, they could easily be at the top of what is going to be a very, very deep Big East yet again.
Well, Isaac, we've got an Adem decision and an Adem decision separated by just one vowel. One of these players is coming back to college. One of them is not coming back to college. Both are affecting their teams in a major way. We'll talk all about that after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500.
What?
That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet does not win. I love betting with FanDuel because they have great promotions literally every single day. The app is safe, it is secure, it is super easy to use, and you can get paid instantly. There is no better place to bet all of the NBA playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch every day. Shout out to the everyday listeners. We got more coverage later this week, continuing to talk about the NBA draft declaration decisions, teams that were negatively impacted, positively impacted, talk about players that withdrew from the NBA draft who are still in the transfer portal. What does that mean for them? What does it mean for Grant Nelson, Arthur Kaluma, other players who are in that build? We got all sorts of conversation coming your way about those topics in the coming weeks. But for now, Isaac, I want to continue our conversation looking at the 6 most impactful, again, outside of Tshiebwe and Edey, most impactful decisions, moves, things that happened at the NBA draft declaration. And I want to start talking about Adam Flagler. Because Adam Flagler stayed in the NBA draft. I don't think that was a shock necessarily. But for Flagler, this represents the 4th guard to leave Baylor. Adam Flagler and Keontae George in the NBA draft process. There's no coming back for either of those two guys. LJ Cryer transferred to Houston, now a Big 12 rival of the Baylor Bears. Dale Bonner transferred to Oklahoma State. That's their 4 leading guards per minutes last year, all out the door. The 3-headed monster of Flagler, George, and Cryer. It was talked about a lot on this show and on Locked On Baylor with our friend Drake Toll and all across the college basketball landscape. And now all of those guys are gone. Fortunately for the Bears, they went out and immediately added Ray J. Dennis out of the transfer portal. At the time, the top-ranked player still available in the portal. It had been reported that basically if Flagler's gone, Dennis is going to Baylor. That ended up coming to fruition. And while it's not a direct across comparison, Dennis was really darn good at Toledo last year. 19.5 points per game, just under 6 assists, a little over 4 boards per game. He was the MAC player of the year. Really talented player. I'm not sure he can fully replicate
Daddy. He was the Mac Daddy.
Yes, exactly. I'm not sure he can fully replicate Flagler, George, and Cryer because that's really a lot to ask.
It's 45 points a game, Andy.
Yeah. I mean, that might be a little tough. It's not Pete Maravich here. I'm not sure we can quite get to those levels, but a really nice piece for Scott Drew's team to bring in after losing Flagler, who I'm not shocked to see declaring for the NBA draft after what was a really tremendous career with the Bears.
Yeah, I mean, it was freshman Keontae George coming in last year that had all the buzz for Baylor. Sure. But let's not forget, Adam Flagler was the leading scorer still for that Baylor team. And man, while if you're Baylor, you kind of maybe hope he comes back, but it is a big loss. A guy that shot, for his career, Adam Flagler shot just shy of 40% on like just over 6 threes again. Ridiculous stuff. Great teammate, great leader. That in fact might be the biggest loss aside from all his incredible production. Not to mention his 4.6 assists per game last year. It's just over a steal again. I could go on about Adam Flagler all day. how do you replace the leadership? That perhaps is my biggest question.
Yeah.
Is that somebody else outside of the vaunted guards that we always hear about from Baylor? Maybe it's Jonathan Tchamwa next year, one of those other older guys coming back. But with Dennis coming in, it's really interesting to me because it's like, man, if I'm a guard and I'm wanting to transfer, I'm heading to Waco, Texas.
Yeah,
I know it's not a sexy destination, but my goodness, I want to go play for Scott Drew if I'm an elite guard. Like Dennis, yes, I know 19.6 in the MAC points per game is not 19.6 points a game in the Big 12.
Sure.
But even if he loses 5 points a game off of that and is down to 14.6, that's right in the territory that Flagler, Cryer, and Keontae George were all at last year. And so why couldn't he do at least that, especially with all the shots that are going to be available to him? So that's going to be a really interesting conversation to have. I'm really curious for us to talk to Coach Alvin Brooks, who we have had on this show, and hear about what the staff is excited about with him. Andy, let's change that third letter of the name from Adam to Adem and head out west to UCLA, where great news for Mick Cronin's team, who has lost. My goodness, I know I'm going to miss somebody here, but Amari Bailey, Tiger Campbell, Jaime Jaquez, somebody else.
Jalen Clark.
Thank you. I was like, I know there's a fourth.
You predicted it.
About. And, that's defense, that's offense, that's everything you're wanting for. And so, like, while it doesn't heal all the wounds, getting Adem Bona back is massive. And Andy, I got to put my hand up and say, by the way, I finally cut my hair. I forgot to say that off the top. So for those of you listening, you haven't noticed this. For those of you watching, you've obviously seen it. I'm like 8 pounds lighter and I'm ready for summer. Anyway, Adem Bona is somebody that just frankly was not on my radar enough at the beginning of last year. But boy, did he grab my attention in a hurry. And it's the same kind of thing with Andre Jackson, where he was like the 6th leading scorer for Arizona, but 7.7 points a game last year, 5.3 boards, 1.7 blocks. Now, Andy, that's in only 23 minutes per game. When we, one of my favorite things to do, you're talking about Basketball Reference, is they do a great job of looking also at the per 40 minutes, per 100 possessions. I mean, if he's averaging all that at 23, that's probably more like 12 points a game, maybe 8 boards and 3 blocks if he's playing 35 or 36. You know what I'm saying? Like if, and with all those guys leaving, that's the number of minutes I expect him to get next year if he's in that sort of shape. Now, as you had noted in some of our conversations, he had that shoulder injury that really put him kind of out of commission or behind the 8 ball, whatever phrase you want to use, toward the end of last season. But Andy, let me ask you this question. Let's fast forward ahead to March 2024. Is Adem Bona a first-team Pac-12 player, knowing that the Pac-12 has 82 guys on that list?
That's a really interesting question. I wouldn't be shocked. I'll put it that way. I think yes. I'll say yes. I won't hedge my bets. I'll say yes. Adem Bona is going to be a first-team All Pac-12 player next year. Let's just roll with it. I'm saying this without having thought super hard about all of the other bigs that are in the conference.
Let me ask it to you this way. Do you think he will have the type of year that could land him in that conversation? Absolutely. Maybe that's a better way to ask it.
Yeah. I mean, I think obviously Umar Ballo is probably the best big in that conference, but Bona is fantastic. And I think if he stays healthy, and that is certainly a question around him, I thought Bona was going to stay in the NBA draft, and I thought that he shouldn't. So I am glad to see him make this decision. I think he probably would have gotten drafted. I saw a lot of draft people talking about him as a 2nd-round pick, even with relatively limited production at UCLA, in part because of the players who were in front of him and just because he was a true freshman and he had the injury and he just wasn't playing a big role. But next year, less scorers around him, 28 to 30 minutes per game. You mentioned extrapolating that out to looking at 12 and 8 and 2.5 blocks per game.
I was under. I just looked it up while you're talking.
That's underestimating what he could possibly do.
I short sold him, Andy.
I think he could average 14, 15 a game for sure. I think he could be up in that 7-8 rebound per game, maybe even more. The defense that he brings, the rim protection, he's just such a high level athlete. He's explosive. I think he's going to be one of the best players in the Pac-12. I'm completely willing to say that a Pac-12 first team selection seems very plausible for Bona, and all of that to lead to what matters. I don't know if it's what he would say matters the most, but it matters a lot, is him being a first round pick next year. Like that, I thought that's the direction you were going. And if we're fast forwarding to June of 2024, I'm putting Adem Bona in the top 20. I honestly think he could be a top 20 selection. And that, again, this is without having thought about that draft class at all. But I do think that Bona is that caliber of player. Explosive, bouncy, shot blocking, high level athletes like that tend to get a lot of attention. And if he can display any more confidence as a scorer, which is something that he needs to prove, but we just had a long conversation about Andre Jackson not being a great scorer, and he's in that first round conversation right now. Jordan Walsh, another player who's in the second round conversation, who's not a great scorer yet. Bona is a guy who I think could be in that conversation, and because of his size, could even be top 20 type guy.
All right, we'll keep our eyes on what happens out there in LA next year. Can Mick Cronin keep it going even with that loss of talent? Now, Andy, the Crimson Tide has lost who projects to be a top 3 player in the upcoming NBA draft, but Nate Oates does return a pair of key guards, but they did lose also their starting center. What does it mean for Nate Oates' team? Has the tide turned? Hey-o! We'll tell you in just a second. All right, Andy, we're carrying on today with what we believe are the 6 most individually impactful decisions that happened at the NBA draft withdrawal deadline for college players. As we've said, we're not having a discussion about Edey or Tshiebwe because right? Those are the most obvious. We want to get into the weeds a little bit. And this next conversation is going to be kind of similar to the one we had with Creighton as we get to Alabama, where we kind of had 3 deadline decisions. And so we're each going to pick one, and then somebody's going to get left out in the cold. So Charles Bediako decides to stay in the draft. Mark Sears comes back to Tuscaloosa, as does Jahvon Quinerly. Andy, I let you choose first last time, so I'm choosing first this time. Give me Jahvon Quinerly. And I think people might have looked at it and think like maybe he's like the 3rd on this list. But here's why I believe he is the most impactful of those 3 decisions. He was Alabama's 4th leading scorer last year, ahead of Bediako, behind Mark Sears. Let me contextualize it with our 3 guys here at 8.7 points a game. He was Alabama's leading assist man at 3.6. He's the highest returning 3-point shooter in terms of percentage, 35.7 on 3.7 attempts per game. And like I say that while also knowing that Mark Sears had more attempts per game and just a slightly lower percentage. So I hear that and would hear your arguments. 82% from the free throw line, 1.9 rebounds, and 0.7 steals. Now, those last several numbers are all below Mark Sears. So you might say to yourself, Andy, why is Isaac taking Quinerly over Sears when clearly some of those numbers are lower? And here's why. Jahvon Quinerly is the engine that makes this team go. We might all remember that as we got into the postseason play last year at the beginning of the SEC tournament, that at that point, Jaden Bradley basically went to Nate Oates and was like, hey, listen, I think Jahvon Quinerly should be running the show here as the older guy, the more experienced guy, the guy that can really keep us going in postseason. And if you look back, Jahvon Quinerly only started 6 games for the Tide last year, but I expect him to be the guy to get the keys from the beginning of the season for Nate Oates, who, you know, they've lost quite a bit. They're still in play for several guys. Like Grant Nelson has taken a visit there later on this week after visiting Baylor, going back to Baylor, and then Arkansas as well. And so that's going to be interesting for us to track on the show. But I think Quinerly is the most impactful of these 3 decisions. Words are hard, Andy.
Words
the most
are hard.
Impactful of these 3 decisions, specifically because he will be the one running the Crimson Tide's floor game next year.
I'm with you on Quinerly, to be perfectly honest. Mark Sears is a great player, but I think getting Quinerly back is more impactful for the team for a lot of the reasons that you just said. But I'm picking Charles Bediako. I'm taking Bediako, and I was split on this a little bit because I do think that Noah Pringle is an exceptionally talented player. And for those of you everyday listeners who listened to an episode last week between myself and our regular guest, Leaf Tulane, we talked about Bediako, and he talked about Pringle being a guy who
Nick Pringle, right?
Yeah. He doesn't necessarily think that that Bediako is getting pushed out the way that, like, Drew Timme and Philip Petrusev happened at Gonzaga, the way that some people speculate Adama Sanogo and Donovan Clingan at UConn. I don't know that it's necessarily that extreme, at least not in my opinion, but Pringle's an extremely talented player. And I think for Bediako, maybe that was a factor, but at the end of the day, Alabama loses a high level rim protector. 1.8 blocks per game in the SEC is very difficult. He's an extremely efficient scorer. Just don't put him on the free throw line. 68.5% on twos, which is extraordinarily, and I could not believe when I read this, 35.5% from the free throw line last year on only 1.7 attempts per game. Obviously some things there for Bediako that could be improved, that I'm sure Alabama would have loved to get a chance to help him improve next season, but he's gone. He's going to test out the NBA draft waters, see what happens for him there. I think he's a high level rim protector, a very explosive athlete, but the complete lack of an outside shot is something that worries me about Bediako's NBA potential. But for Alabama next year, it leaves a pretty gaping hole at the center position. Again, they have some depth there that I think can fill in. If they can land a player like Grant Nelson, then the Bediako loss certainly isn't as impactful. But this didn't feel like a loss that Nate Oates and Alabama was expecting.
Yeah.
And I think that is what really kind of hamstrung them in that situation of, hey, we kind of thought that our center position was completely set, and now we have to figure out some pieces around it. And that's kind of why I have it as the most impactful one. Fair.
I hear you. One thing I will say about the 3-point shooting is Trace Jackson Davis took attempts in his entire 4 years at Indiana and is potentially a late first round pick in this year's draft. So there is a pathway to high NBA success still, but I would say, as you're pointing out, that the ceiling is limited because of that.
You're right. Should we talk about Terrence Shannon?
Let's talk about Terrence Shannon.
Let's talk about Terrence Shannon, our final one on our list for today. And Isaac and I went back and forth a handful of times about multiple other players that could have been in this spot. And like we said, if you have players that you thought we would talk about here, that you want to hear us talk about, or that you were just mad that we didn't talk about, please leave us comments on YouTube, because there's plenty of other players that have not gotten in this discussion yet, but that we will talk about. But Terrence Shannon felt like the last player for us to talk about here because he was the leading scorer for Illinois. And anytime you, especially when you're not necessarily expecting it, when you suddenly find out that the player who led your team in scoring is coming back, that's a pretty good gift. That's a pretty nice gift for Coach Underwood and the Illini. 17.2 points per game last year. The only other player who was in double figures for that team was Matthew Meyer. Again, Coleman Hawkins is obviously back as well, and we could probably lump those two guys together because getting their first and third leading scorers coming back when both of them were on the precipice of taking their NBA draft stock and just moving on in that direction. It's really nice for this program to get both those guys back. Shannon's a guy who 4.5 boards per game, a little under 3 assists per game, still needs to improve the outside shooting, is only about 32% on that, was a better 3-point shooter while he was at Texas Tech. So perhaps we'll see a return to more of that 35-36% range for Shannon. But again, anytime you can get a guy back on a Power 5 program in the Big Ten and a good program in Illinois, and you can get a guy back who averaged 17 a game, I think you're pretty darn happy with that. And that's where the Illini are with getting Terrence Shannon back in the mix.
And especially like when we think about the Big Ten, and I know this is unfair, and it's probably because of football, we think about plotting big men and Purdue's 8 million 7-footers and all that. Mm-hmm. But when you look at it, at Terrence Shannon and what an electric basketball player he is, like it's just a piece that not a lot of teams are going to have. Not to mention he's a 5th-year guy, and so all of that experience, the defense he learned at Texas Tech, bringing all of that to Illinois, and man, I would be very excited if I were Coach Underwood as well. What's interesting to me is like with what Illinois will bring in terms of freshmen as well, it just feels like a nice kind of mixture to me for Illinois to have the pieces to compete in the Big Ten. Now, I will say I haven't like done a Big Ten power ranking yet, but it feels like I don't think it's enough for Illinois to get above either Purdue or Michigan State. I think they're the clear top tier of the Big Ten right now.
Yeah.
But Illinois, I would say, is, if not the leader of tier 2, definitely in tier 2, right? Nipping at the heels of those other 2 teams. And if things break right, they will do well. But I would expect them to get a top 4 seed in the Big Ten tournament when we get to this point next year. And so big time to have Terrence Shannon coming back, as well as Andy, as you said, getting Coleman Hawkins back, their 3rd leading scorer from last year. So congrats to Coach Underwood and the Illini, because they made this list, and it's a very prestigious list, Andy, as we all know.
Folks, like we said already, if you have some players that you want to hear us to talk about that maybe we didn't get to discuss on this show, some teams that had some decisions that went one way or another that we haven't gotten to, that's the plan for the month of June. If we're being honest, we're basically going to be talking about what teams got better, what teams maybe didn't get better when the NBA draft. Of course, the transfer portal will continue to look at that as we see more and more players kind of getting picked off out of there. There's not as much talent in the transfer portal as there has been in the past, but there's still some very good players. And like we mentioned, Grant Nelson's now kind of more available. Arthur Kaluma's more available. There's a lot of players in there that are going to change hands, and we're going to continue to monitor that. We're going to look at our way too early, but not as early as before, top 10, top 5, as we kind of get a better sense of what college basketball is going to look like next season. So thanks for sticking with us. Of course, we shout out again to those everyday listeners. You can find the show wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, so you can see Isaac's new do. Again, if you haven't checked that out yet, we also have a new graphics package that makes the show look even cleaner and crisper. And so if you are not somebody who has subscribed to the show on YouTube, now is an excellent time to do so. Just go find the show on YouTube, search Locked On College Basketball, and hit that big subscribe button. We would very, very much appreciate it. Until next time, though, peace out.